Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Engage in Trade, Origin, Marking, and Duty Savings, What You Need to Know. My name is Susan Spitz. I am the Manager of International Business here at the World Trade Center, St. Louis, and we're very happy that you joined us today as we kick off our monthly speaker series. This year, we are going to be, this month, we're going to be focusing on some pretty technical topics, and we've got some experts in the room. Just a few housekeeping rules to let you know about. All participants will be muted for the duration of the presentation. However, if you wish to ask questions, you can do so using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you hover down over the bottom of your screen, a QA button should appear, and you can put your questions in there. We will do our best to get to those at the end of the panel discussion. I did want to let you know that a recording of this presentation will be made available within a week after this webinar is completed. And so you don't need to take notes. You'll be able to get a copy of the recording. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Stella Sheehan, the Deputy Director of World Trade Center St. Louis. Stella has been with the World Trade Center for over 18 years, and she leads our trade team, consisting of myself and Annie Mbali, who is our webmaster today. She also heads up our Chancellor's Certificate in International Trade, online export trading. She oversees our 16 sister cities and is the executive producer of our signature event, Growing Global. Stella was born and raised in Ireland and has lived, worked, and studied extensively in international markets, including Belgium, France, Italy, and the UK. She holds a BA in French and Italian from the National University of Ireland, Galway, and an MA in Applied Languages for Business from the University of Ulster at Coleraine in Northern Ireland. And she's also a graduate of Leadership St. Louis here. She was also recently appointed to the Missouri District Export Council last year. And I always say she's the wind beneath the wings of our executive director, Tim Nowak. And Stella is going to give us a brief overview today of the World Trade Center's work and introduce our panel. Over to you, Stella.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that very gracious introduction. And thanks to all of you for joining us this morning for what I know will be a very informative presentation indeed. As Susan mentioned, I lead the trade side of the house, and we like to say at the World Trade Center that we have three main pillars: people, trade, and investment, the three key equal ingredients that go into making a global city. The people side consists of our 16 sister cities and our most well-known initiative, the St. Louis Mosaic Project, headed up by my colleague Betsy Cohen. And that is an initiative to attract foreign-born to the region and assist them by way of programming and networking once they have arrived here. The trade side provides companies with the tools they need to trade internationally by way of counseling, referrals to our federal and state partners with whom we work very closely, and organizing educational events like the one you're attending today. Last but certainly not least, our foreign direct investment, or FDI pillar, as we call it in here, led by my colleague Sean Mullins, assists companies around the globe who may be interested in setting up their North American base in the St. Louis region, and simultaneously assisting the companies who have already chosen St. Louis and wish to expand and continue to invest here. So with that, let's get to the introductions. We are very fortunate to have two subject matter experts with us today. Lindsay Bernson-Wardlaw is the Vice President of Trades Advisory Services at Amelie Trade Compliance Consulting, where she assists clients in understanding and complying with US and global trade restrictions. Before joining Amelie, Lindsay was an international trade attorney at Sydney Austin LLP and Gibson Dunn and Crutcher LLP. And prior to that, she was a trade compliance analyst and program manager at 2 Fortune 500 companies. Lindsay is also a licensed US custom broker and passed the April 2016 CBE with the highest score in the nation. So we no doubt have a wonderful expert with us this morning. Lindsay has developed export controls, sanctions, anti-boycott, customs, and anti-corruption compliance programs, both in-house and for clients, and she has written hundreds of trade compliance policies, procedures, and work instructions. She also helps her clients and their counsel with trade classification, licensing, disclosures, and remedial measures for OFAC, BIS, DDTC, Census, and CBP. Lindsay holds a BA in International Political Economy from the University of Texas at Dallas and earned her JD from the University of Michigan School of Law, where she was also the editor-in-chief of the Michigan Journal of International Law. And now to Lindsay's colleague, Casey Grace. Casey Grace is a senior consultant at Amelie Trade Compliance Consulting, where she assists clients in developing and managing their trade compliance programs. Casey is also a licensed US customs broker and has over 12 years of experience working for global companies in the electronics, footwear, consumer retail goods, and technical ceramics industries, managing both import and export activities. She has developed and implemented successful compliance programs for customs compliance, export controls, sanctions, and restricted party screening. She's an advocate for bringing compliance to the table as a conversational topic and normalizing the regulations as a part of doing business. Casey's top priority is understanding her clients' needs and tailoring a compliance program to fit their business. So we are undoubtedly looking forward to a wonderful program. And with that, I will hand you over to Lindsay.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Stella. It is our pleasure to be here today with the World Trade Center St. Louis's vast membership and all of you. Before we get started, I wanted to talk for just a brief moment, and as Casey pulls up our slides, for just a brief moment about what we do at Amelie Trade Compliance Consulting. So we help deliver trade compliance programs, risk assessments, audits, monitoring, procedural support, and then also managed services like import and export classifications, country of origin determination relevant to today, and restricted party screening for our clients who are small, medium, and large multinational corporations. So if that's of interest to you, feel welcome to reach out afterwards. We have a slide with contact information for the company at the end of this deck, so when it gets circulated to you, you are more than welcome to send us an email. And now I will allow Casey to kick us off.
Had to unmute first. Thank you very much, Lindsay, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. So today we're talking about origin, marking, and duty savings. And so to start, before we get started into our presentation and getting into the nitty-gritty of the country of origin, we wanted to get an understanding of where in the company country of origin is determined for you. And so we have a poll question coming up to answer really quickly, and the answers are anonymous. So the poll question is, who determines the country of origin in your company? Is it logistics, the compliance team, engineering or product development group, a third-party supplier, another group, and maybe you're not sure what country of origin is.
Casey may have said this, but these polls are anonymous. So we encourage you to participate as a means of moving this conversation forward, but you shouldn't feel as though we will know what answer was associated with your company, because we will not.
And we'll give just a couple more seconds for folks to answer before we close and see the results. Okay, I think we can close the poll and see. There we are. Okay, so pretty even split between compliance team. We have folks who have it in their engineering or product development, or it's with another group. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, for answering. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so what is country of origin? So to note, there is no agreed international definition of country of origin for customs purposes. However, the US customs process makes a good example for international practice. The US customs definition of country of origin can be found in Part 134 under country of origin marking. Its most simple version is that it's the country where the article was made, created, or manufactured. Then there's an exception to this statement, which is the substantial transformation determination. We will talk more about this later on in the presentation. I do want to highlight what country of origin is not. It's not not always where the item was exported from. So an example of this is maybe it's exported from Vietnam, but the country of origin is actually China. It's also not always the last country where the item was changed or manufactured. So same example as before, maybe the item had an assembly step in Vietnam, but the country of origin is still China. And then lastly, and this is one to be aware of and be careful of when you're working with suppliers, is that it's not always proven solely by a certificate of origin or a consular attestation. So then also lastly, keep in mind that every country or jurisdiction has its own rules of origin, and they may not completely align with what the US requires to import. Over to you, Lindsay.
Excellent. So before we kind of dive into how to determine country of origin, we wanted you to understand what country of origin gets used for, because it's a variety of purposes, and in some cases, the determination isn't identical between purposes. So starting, we use country of origin to determine the duty rate that will apply to our goods when they're imported into whichever country we're importing into. In this presentation, I think Casey shared this with you, we will largely be focusing on the United States as an example for how countries handle country of origin, but the World Customs Organization does have material on the rules of origin across different regimes, across different importing countries that we share with you in the resources slide at the end of this deck. Even though there's not one standard model, there are some more accepted rules, and those are really exemplified by the US model that we'll talk through today. So in your importing country, determining the duty rate that will apply to your product. This might be the standard rate that applies to all products from most countries coming in. Most countries now refer to this as the normal trade relations rate or the most favored nations rate. This will be the vast majority of countries that they're dealing with, except for some countries that receive a higher duty rate because they are the subject of poor trade relations. In the United States, those are US column 2 duty rates, and they really apply to a small subset of sanctioned countries, if you're familiar with those. Then we get to some countries that actually have an even lower duty rate, maybe free or just significantly reduced from that standard duty rate. And those are countries where there is a trade agreement or preferential trade program between the importing nation and the nation from which the export is occurring, or from which the goods are originating, depending on kind of difference there for your good. Then we also use country of origin to determine if there are yet another set of duties. So we have our standard duty rate, whether it's the normal rate for almost all goods, the higher rate for certain bad countries, or the lower rate for certain friendly countries. We may also have on top of that a separate duty, and that would be a punitive duty if we're importing from a country that we believe is engaging in unfair trade practices of some kind. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these in a moment. And then we also use origin to help us determine how, whether the good may be emitted at all. There are some countries from which we have absolute prohibitions on receiving goods as a matter of sanctions. There are also some countries from which we will impose a quota on the goods coming in from that country to avoid flooding our market. There are two different types of quotas that you might be aware of. There are absolute quotas, which mean we will only take so much of this good, period, at its kind of standard duty rate. And then there are tariff rate quotas where we will take maybe a certain number of imports of a certain good, a certain quantity of that good at one tariff rate, a lower tariff rate. And then after we've hit that threshold, we will bump the duty rate up. So everything after the first 500 units of this good coming into the country for the year has a higher tariff rate. So country of origin can help us determine if our good is subject to those quotas, either type. And then the last reason that we would use country of origin would be to think about how we mark our good. And when I say mark our good, it's the label or the stamp or the embossing on the good that says where it's from. It says origin, whichever country, country of origin, China. Other language you might see that can be confusing, and we'll talk about this later, is made in China, product of China. That marking requirement is usually strictly enforced. by importing jurisdictions because it allows them to confirm that they are in fact applying the right duty rate and that the good matches the paperwork that you've put in an entry. So it has a really important audit function, and it also helps consumers to make informed decisions about what they're purchasing. So country of origin gets used for marking as well. And we'll go into a little bit more depth later today about the normal marking requirements for foreign origin goods, the J list as a special set of exceptions in the United States, and it's kind of mirrored by exceptions in other countries for goods that are very hard to mark, and we give them special treatment. And then the last thing we'll talk about, even though it's not here on the slide, is that there are some special domestic marking regimes for goods that never leave your country, the country where you manufactured the goods. And those really don't end up impacting our customs requirements at all. So if we think about made in the United States, made in America, if the good isn't ever coming from outside of the United States, if it was made here, then those labeling requirements aren't governed by US Customs. They're actually governed by an entirely different agency that's trying to make sure that you aren't defrauding American customers. Next slide, please, Casey. So as an example of what I was describing earlier with regard to determining the duty rate, if we look at this specific example, we see here padlocks and locks. We have a tariff entry for padlocks and locks in heading 8301. And for these goods, we see that they would come in for most countries, this general rate under rates of duty column 1 general at 2.3%. So that's the rate for the vast majority of countries that are interacting with the United States. Then we have a special column under column 1, so a sub-column for special. This is where we see free trade agreements or preferential trade programs, and we know if they apply. So in this column, we go from 2.3% for most countries to coming in duty-free if we're taking advantage of one of these free trade regimes. As we'll talk about later, and Casey will really detail, free trade regimes may have their own rules of origin and their own determination logic, distinct from the logic that we apply for goods that fall into this general category. It's harder to prove something qualifies for that extra special low duty rate, right? We have to be a little bit more granular in our analysis. And that makes some sense. We want to make sure goods really are deserving of that preferential treatment. Then we have column 2, and column 2 is the rate for those less savory countries or the countries with which we have poor trade relations right now. And other countries have something comparable to this. So for the United States, those countries in column 2 are Belarus, Russia, North Korea, and Cuba. So if you're familiar with US sanctions, you can see that these are repeat players. They're not all of the sanctioned countries, but they are among the sanctioned countries. Anything you'd like to add there, Casey?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Perfect, yeah.
Next slide then. Okay, so we mentioned free trade agreements, and on this slide, we just wanted to give you a taste of free trade agreements that that could potentially apply. So if you're thinking about this webinar from the perspective of how do I determine origin and how do I make origin work for me, it's helpful to realize that at least for US imports, there are quite a few available free trade agreements. You do have to follow this special origin logic and determination tree for these agreements, and not all of the agreements use the same logic. But you can see that there are agreements around the world with countries in the Middle East and Latin America, in Asia as well, and also a really large preferential treatment program in Africa. There used to be an even larger regime that many of you may have heard of by name called the Generalized System of Preferences, the GSP. That program is currently expired and in lapse. It hasn't yet been renewed by Congress, and Congress has expressed some disinterest in renewing that program because they felt like it was giving too many countries access to a really low duty rate, including some countries that we think probably have quite developed economies and may not need to have the benefit of this GSP program, which was developed to help less developed countries get lower rates into the US market. So for example, if we look at a couple of key programs, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, partners are US, Mexico, Canada. It replaces the older NAFTA regime. If we look at the DR CAFTA, that's the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and then it's a kind of Central American free trade agreement, which includes Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, and then the United States. So in each of these cases, we've listed the partner countries, but the US is also a party. If you were importing into one of those countries and you could show US origin, you would also get the benefit of the free trade agreement. Next slide, please. I promised that we would come back to the idea of punitive duties, and we'll actually see an even more in-depth example later in the presentation as we put everything together. But here, just conceptually, there are two major types of punitive duties in the US context that I'd like you to have in mind when you're thinking about setting your own sourcing and manufacturing operations, right? So that you develop a country of origin that is beneficial for your product. And we'll kind of reach an answer that gives you a duty rate that you're happy with based on appropriately sourcing and manufacturing your goods. So the first item that I want to make you aware of is US Section 301 duties. Some of you may already be aware of these. Many goods coming from China, the majority of them at this point, are subject to US Section 301 duties, so named after the statutory provision that imposed these duties. They functionally stack on top of your normal duty rate for China for a given good. You will actually have two classifications for the good, the standard classification and a Section 301 classification. And again, Casey will actually demonstrate this later. But when this happens, if the goods are from China and this second classification for 301 applies, you will have an entirely secondary duty rate that gets added to your product. In some cases, that's as high as 25%. So it can be quite substantial. And it's intended on a policy basis to incentivize companies not to manufacture certain things in China. The US rationale has been long-standing kind of fights with China over its the fairness of its trade and labor policies, as well as policies within China of requiring US companies to share intellectual property with Chinese companies when they start there, in the sense that there might be broader IP, intellectual property related theft or foul play in China. So as a result, the US has imposed its own duty regime to counter what it considers to be the unfair effects of Chinese policy. The next program I want to discuss is anti-dumping and countervailing duties. You'll see this on an entry when you fill out your entry paperwork. In box 3, it will list whether the particular entry is subject to ADD CVDs or AD CVDs, depending on how your company likes to abbreviate that. So these duties are applied, again, when an importing country, not just the United States, believes that the country of origin has engaged in unfair trade practices. For example, dumping is when a country's company sells goods into the importing market at a price below the price it would cost to make those goods in the home country and sell them there. So there's a sense that you are selling them too cheaply, right, in the importing market because you want to undercut local businesses and then possibly raise the rates after local industry has been decimated. Countervailing duties are applied when there's a sense that the home country government has subsidized production in that country to make it cheaper than production in the importing country and again undercut that market. So both forms of foul play. And the World Trade Organization authorizes countries around the world to employ anti-dumping and countervailing duties when they have legally determined through some type of administrative law process that these goods fall afoul of one of these two issues, dumping or subsidies. So any country can actually impose countervailing or anti-dumping duties, and we'll talk today more about how it looks when the United States imposes them. Next slide, Casey. I believe it's your turn.
Thank you. Okay, so if you remember a couple slides ago, we mentioned that we would go through the rule that said that country of origin is based on where an article is made, created, or manufactured. So an example of this where that rule is kind of straightforward is rice that's grown and harvested from Thailand and shipped to the U.S. That would be grown and created and then shipped. So then on the other side, there are other examples where it's a little more complex, like electronics, for example, where components that make up the final product are from multiple countries. So here we'll start to dive into the fundamental principles of how to determine the country of origin for an item. So the US CBP informed compliance publication called Rules of Origin breaks down origin determination into a couple of decision trees. So Lindsay had talked about the most favored nation or normal trade relations. And so the first is related to those countries. So it's essentially for countries in the US where we don't have an agreement or program in place for preferential tariffs. So in this scenario, textiles and apparel items are not included in the determination. There's a separate kind of decision tree for that we'll discuss on a couple slides from now. So the basics are to start with reviewing if the item is wholly obtained or produced, which like in the example of rice grown and harvested in Thailand. Then if the item is not obtained or produced in that country, then you have to use the substantial transformation determination. This includes reviewing if the processing activity in a country changes the name. So under substantial transformation, if it changes the name of the item, the character of the item, or the use of the item in a substantial manner. In some cases, though, CBP strays from traditional substantial transformation tests and looks instead at where the feature or the component imparts the essential character of the finished good, even if there's subsequent assembly or manufacturing that incorporates the component into an article with a new name or use. So a really good example of when an item is considered to impart the essential character of a finished good is when a printed circuit board assembly, or PCBA, is pre-programmed to perform a certain task and then included into machinery or a casing to interface with other components. In this example, CBP could say that the identity of the item is set at the time the PCBA is programmed and installed into the assembly, even though there's additional manufacturing steps before the product is completely finished. And actually, in this scenario, there was a court case where the country of origin had been determined to be right at the PCBA level, and that's where the country of origin was assigned. So we mentioned earlier that the US rules of origin make a good example of international practice. And that's because while there's no international definition of origin, countries can apply their own test if they do so consistently. But the World Customs Organization, which many countries are members of, accepts both the wholly obtained or produced and substantial transformation tests. All right, Lindsay, you're up. Oh, you're on mute.
I realized I was on mute. I'm sorry, everyone. While we talked about the fact that the substantial transformation test is usually a test regarding what results from manufacturing, right? If it has a new name, character, or use, or potentially looking at its essence. There are situations in which you'll look at a CBP customs ruling, and CBP will indicate that it's evaluating the complexity of manufacturing at each step of the manufacturing process. And in part, it does this because a less complex operation for manufacturing generally can't yield a substantial transformation, right? So if you look at this list, there are, in some cases, explicit exclusions for these items, depending on the free trade agreement or the rules of origin you're looking at. But activities like combining a bunch of different things into a single package, that doesn't make a new product necessarily, unless you're making a set. And we'll put sets aside for now. Cleaning or removing dust or paint from a product, that doesn't really make a new product. It's just the same product, but cleaner, right? So there's reasons to think to yourself, if you're trying to figure out if a substantial transformation is occurring and you're having a hard time with that name, character, use test, There are some types of operations that are really kind of simple assembly, or you might think of them as incidental or as minor processing. There are different ways these are referred to throughout different trade programs. You can kind of put these tasks aside and say to yourself, if all I did in a country was one of these things, it's probably not resulting in a substantial transformation. In contrast, if you're machining the item, polishing it, plating it, sewing together a new garment from pieces of fabric, those are types of activities that make something new, right? So if you get pieces of furniture and you assembled them into a new, like from kind of table legs into a table, that might be a substantial transformation depending on your program. If you had lumber and you milled it down into actual kind of nicely sanded pieces of wood, and then you went through the efforts to actually apply polish or some other what's the word I'm looking for, Casey? You make it so that it has stain. That's the word I wanted. That might be an operation that results in the new piece of wood, right, that has been modified, having a substantial transformation as well. It's more than just painting. Over time, right, those stack up into making a new product. But if you had a finished table and you just painted it red, it's still a table, it's just a red table. So that's the kind of logic that you'll be applying. The tests are a little bit more granular, but I think this big picture can help people who are really struggling to get the concept to start with.
Okay, so next we've got the rules of origin for textile and apparel, including a specific section for textile and apparel items from Israel. So specifically, you can find this in 19 CFR Part 102.21. And the process allows for a decision tree approach that is done in the following order, and it is specific to be in this order. So we start with reviewing again, write down simple evaluation of is it wholly obtained or produced. If it's not, then you move to the next step, which is reviewing for a tariff shift classification. Now, this tariff shift classification in 102.21 is actually very specific to Part 102. And in that section of the regulations, there will be a table that will give you your HTS code and tell you where it had to change from. So in the case of a piece of cotton turning into a shirt, it would tell you where it would have to change from in order to qualify. So when you're looking at a tariff shift classification, you have to have a costed bill of materials with the country of origin for each component so that you know what the main component was and how it shifted, because it is based on the HTS code. So then if your tariff shift cannot be applied, then you move to reviewing where in which country where the item was knit to shape. Then you move to the last two options, which involve the assembly process. And the first review is based on the country where the most important assembly or manufacturing occurred. And then the very last option is using the last country where an important assembly or manufacturing occurred. If you've reached this last step, it's really important to have your documentation for how you've reached that and how you've gone through the other 4 steps to reach number 5 here.
Casey, can I ask you a question here?
Yes.
If I can classify the good based on the shift in tariff classification, do I need to go on to consider any of those other things?
No, you do not, because you would stop at the tariff shift classification, and that would be your country of origin.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, so now we move to preferential rules of origin. So this is where we have some sort of free trade agreement or preferential trade program. In the regulations, 19 CFR Part 10 is probably one of the biggest in Title 19, but it holds all the requirements for each of the free trade agreement and preferential trade programs. And in each of those sections, you will find what the rules of origin is for each of the programs. And so they are specific to the programs, and it'll be important to go to that section and go to the subsection where the rules of origin are to follow kind of the instructions of how to apply it. And so while there's variations of these rules of origin, the highest kind of level here that are generally the steps in most cases, again, starting with wholly obtained or produced, or the substantial transformation method, or a combination of a tariff shift or regional value content method. So Customs has put together this amazing side-by-side comparison of free trade agreements and preferential, they call it preferential trade legislation programs. It's a multi-page document that has all of the agreements and programs that are currently active. And this is kind of a small screenshot, but what it includes is information on the rules of origin citation, which is where to find it in the regulations, summary of rules of origin, information about tariff shifts, and then more. There's more information on multiple pages. We have a link to this PDF on our resource slide at the very end. However, for whatever reason, if you're viewing this and you don't have the link, you can Google. So in the blue text, you'll see side-by-side comparison of free trade agreements. If you take that and then you add CBP at the end and put it into Google, it should pop up with the PDF version of this. The most recent version is from August 2021, so make sure that you're clicking on the right year because they've got a couple versions of these that have existed over time. So now we're going to go into an example using USMCA. The logic under USMCA is, again, in the order of wholly obtained, substantial transformation, tariff shift, and then the regional content value. Then we have what's called a de minimis qualification. And what this means is that there cannot be a certain percentage of non-originating goods after considering whether the components underwent a tariff shift in the qualifying country. Non-originating goods means that the origin of those components is outside of the trade agreement. So in this case, with USMCA, it includes US, Canada, and Mexico. So non-originating goods would mean origins outside of US, Canada, or Mexico. For this agreement for USMCA, it has a 10% de minimis threshold. So if you are under that 10%, then essentially those items can be excluded from the calculation. If you are over that 10%, so again, the calculation, so kind of going to the calculation, how would you know how to do this calculation? You would need to know with a costed bill of materials, all of the components that are going into your finished good, their country of origin, and the value of those components. And it's a calculation that's done. So if the calculation puts you over that 10% threshold, then you don't qualify for the USMCA free trade agreement. On the topic of documentation, so in number 3 there, we have a slide at the end that talks about what kinds of records should be kept in order to support a country of origin determination. All right, so Lindsay alluded to this slide. We're going to put all of our knowledge together of what the general rate is, the punitive duties, and free trade agreement options. So I'm going to walk you through using a scenario, the same scenario we used at the beginning, the example of your padlock. So under HTS 8301-10-2000 specifically, we're going to look at how the country of origin affects the duty rate. So again, this item has a 2.3% ad valorem duty rate, which is the standard duty rate based on the value of the item. So if your padlock is $2, for example, the duty rate would be about 5 cents. You'll note on this slide that I have a couple of areas that are highlighted in blue and then highlighted in red. So we're going to start by looking at what the blue indicates. Next to that 2.3% in tiny, tiny font is a superscript note bearing the number 1. So that indicates that there's an additional requirement on this HTS. And if you're looking at the HTS online, you can hover your mouse over it and it'll pop up what the additional requirements are. If you're viewing it on a PDF, then you can go to the footer page to see what it indicates. In this case, what it indicates is that this HTS code is subject to to a provision within Chapter 99, which is also known as the Section 301 tariffs. They're very specific codes, HTS codes, that represent Section 301 tariffs. So, for example, we'll say that your padlock has a country of origin of China, and now there is an additional 7.5% duty rate on top of your 2.3% standard rate. So now your $2 padlock has a duty rate of 5 cents from your standard column and 15 cents from your Section 301 duty, which makes it an additional 20 cents duty rate to bring it into the United States. So if you look now at the red box, or special column, note that there's a whole bunch of letters after the word free. All of these are indications, they're called special program indicators, that tell you which free trade agreement the item is eligible for. The S at the end represents the USMCA free trade agreement. So we're going to change the scenario a little bit. We're going to say that your padlock is made in Mexico. It's been determined to be country of origin Mexico. So now your item, the padlock, comes into the U.S. duty-free, which would be a savings of between 5 cents and 20 cents a unit, depending on if you were sourcing it somewhere else. And if you think about how many padlocks in this example you might order, when you're ordering thousands of them, that 20 cents really adds up over time. You're next, Lindsay.
So as we previewed at the beginning, one of the ways, right, that origin can impact your business, and one of the ways that you must use the origin determination that you make is in how you mark your goods. Next slide. So we kind of told you, right, that there are different rules of origin for preferential programs, for non-preferential imports, for textiles and non-textiles. There are also differences in how you apply the rules of origin for marking. So you will use Part 102, 19 CFR Part 102, for imports of goods from Canada, Mexico, those that are eligible for the US, Bahrain, or US, Mexico free trade agreements, and for textiles or apparel, including those under the US-Israel FTA. And in those cases, that set of country of origin rules will also apply to the origin that you mark on the product. You will use Part 134's origin rules for any other items from any other country or from Bahrain, Morocco, or Israel that don't qualify for those free trade agreements. So it's important to be aware that there are these two different locations you would turn to, but we have tried, I know this is a very brief webinar, but we've tried to spell out to you where you would find the different rules in each case as they apply to your products. Next slide. There are some exceptions to marking. So I think first, let me talk about what is required with regard to marking. In general, your product has to be marked conspicuously, legibly, indelibly, that is in a way that cannot be removed, and permanently, in as much as the marking must reach the final consumer of the good every time. The exceptions for that are when there are quite a few, but when you're going to be consuming a bulk consumable, or you have something like crude or oil that really cannot be marked but on the container, situations in which you are the final consumer and you are bringing the item in for import so that you can then incorporate it into another product, or again, consume it as part of making another product. In all of those cases, there might be an exception. There are also exceptions for items on the so-called J list in Part 134.33J. These items are excluded because it's hard to mark them, or they're so small it's not cost effective to mark them. Those are things like screws, nuts, bolts, buttons, playing cards, fresh cut flowers where you could put like a sticker on the wrapper, but the flowers themselves can't really be marked. Ribbons, sugar, other kind of food products can sometimes be excluded if they're in bulk like that. The granulation of the sugar is unique, right? You would put a sticker on an avocado, but it's hard to put a sticker on sugar unless it's on the outside of the container. So there's this requirement that you mark everything and you mark it well, but If you have something on the accepted list, you are permitted instead simply to mark the outermost container, but that container must be marked. The consequences of not marking are very serious. They are a 10% fine on your goods if you were unable to mark them, but you can't simply choose to pay that fine. Customs will actually, if it determines that any amount of your product is not marked properly at import, say it holds a piece aside for investigation or takes a sample, it will then ask you to redeliver the goods. You may be able to hold them in constructive custody. You will be asked to mark them then, which may be impossible, now that the good is already manufactured. And then if you cannot mark them, you will be asked to either pay a fine or re-export them. So it can be quite expensive to go through that marking process too late. You should be aware of marking rules while manufacturing so that you can include markings at that time. But depending on the product, there are a lot of CBP rulings out there about where and how to mark. For products that are like made out of metal, that's sometimes stamping the product or engraving it. For products like textiles, that can be including a sticker, or usually it's a label within the product, but some other products it's a sticker on the outside of the container. And those need to be put on in such a way that they adhere until they reach the final customer, if they're not kind of truly indelible and part of the product to begin with, like a stamp. Next slide.
Really quickly, Lindsay, just as a heads up, we have about
Yes.
5 minutes before we move to Q&A.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So the last thing we wanted to talk about here is when you have country of origin, United States. As I previewed at the beginning of this session, only items that are being imported are under the jurisdiction of a customs agency. If you're shipping to another country, so you're shipping outside of the United States, then that customs agency's rules might apply, and you might need to mark your product as origin United States. If you make something in the United States and it's never leaving the country, and it's not even going abroad to like a maquiladora in Mexico and then coming back, you may not have to mark the origin of the product. And in some cases, if you're manufacturing something as part of a free trade agreement with the United States and you're going out and coming back in, you may be excluded from marking requirements as part of that additive manufacturing process if the final assembly is happening in the United States. You'd have to look at the specific rules for your program to confirm. If you are shipping your item into the United States from another country, and the final assembly isn't happening in the United States, but for whatever reason, as part of your preferential program, you can claim origin United States, that might be a situation in which you do need to go ahead and mark as COO United States for an import into the United States, but that is not nearly the most common use case for people trying to mark their product as made in the United States. Usually that's a matter of showing, kind of pride in local manufacturing. So in that case, Casey, can you go to the next slide?
Yes, actually, before we touch upon that slide, we have one more poll question. It's a very short one. And so we just want to ask really quickly, do you have any items in your company that are country of origin US? So we'll launch the poll question now and give probably 30 to 45 seconds for an answer. Okay, a couple more seconds if you haven't submitted your response. Okay, we can go ahead and close the poll. Awesome, we do have quite a few made country of origin US. That's awesome. Wonderful. Thank you everybody for submitting a poll question or poll answer, excuse me.
So for products that are made in the United States, there are requirements for labeling, as I think we've previewed, that are not administered by CBP. Those are instead administered by the Federal Trade Commission, and it is very carefully trying to make sure that consumers aren't deceived with regard to what is really an American-made product. And so as a result, you would need to go look at the FTC standards to confirm what's permitted. One thing I can tell you is if you have a statement like made in USA, but the country of origin is actually China, according to rules of origin, because you imported it, you will have to have both of those phrases equally sized and next to each other from a customs perspective. So if the item isn't actually manufactured here, but you have a reason to believe that it's still made in USA in some portion, you want to make that statement, you have to be very careful from a customs perspective there that the two statements are given equal spacing and weight and are both equally visible. There are also some procurement standards we're not going to get into here with regard to Buy American, but we want you to know that they exist. They are just not part of the customs regime. Next slide.
Okay, so we have a couple more slides left. So like with all things required by the government, you have to keep documentation and supporting information to show how you reached your country of origin determination. And so very high level on supporting documents, keep all records that prove the country of origin that was assigned to the product. And then so your detailed view is going to be, costed bill of material from the supplier or suppliers, depending on how it's manufactured, that shows each of the components in your final product, the country of origin of each component, and its cost. If you are using a regional value content method or qualifying something based on a de minimis calculation, you will need detailed documents and sometimes even supplier invoices or pricing structures that support all of the values that you used in that calculation. Contracts and agreements with the supplier or factory are useful in showing how the sourcing activities will happen. So who is responsible for sourcing? Are there any rules about where your manufacturer or supplier, where they're getting their items from? Sometimes there's agreements that a company states you need to purchase from these approved vendors. Other companies allow the manufacturers to go and source their own, but that information all comes into play when you are doing your country of origin determination, and especially with your free trade agreements. So sometimes when there's complex workflows or lots of changes in manufacturing, or changes in location midway through, like in a lot development process, you're going to need to have a workflow to show how and where each item is manufactured, so that you can essentially marry up the lot by lot production records to show the origin. A case at the Court of International Trade last year, Cyber Power, demonstrates where this level of documentation is needed. Then also to remember, because sourcing changes frequently, and so it's important to remember that you review your country of origin as your product changes. So if there's something in the sourcing line that changes, even a component part, the product really needs to be reviewed again, because even with free trade agreements, if a sourcing event changed and it changed to a country that's considered non-originating, that might be the difference between being able to claim a free trade agreement program versus not. Lastly, if you're completely unsure of the origin of your item, or it's a very high level, very high complex manufacturing process, the best place to go is going to be CBP, and request a binding ruling for origin. To note, make sure that you do this and get your ruling done before you start to import your products. Okay.
We do have a slide here, as promised, that has links to the sites we think will be most useful to you in determining origin. One quick plug here, besides the chart that Casey pointed out under the US CBP section, is for findrulesoforigin.org. This is a collaboration between country governments and the World Customs Organization, and you can go in and plug in the country that you want to import from, the country that you want to import to, and you can compare the rules of origin requirements for your products, which I think is really, really helpful and can get to some of the specific questions that you might have with regard to what rules apply to your product that we may not have time to get to today. And now we are ready to open the floor for a few minutes of questions.
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you guys. That was really great information. We do have, since we're running a little short on time, what I'm going to do is have us put up our closing slides and then take the Q&A, so that those of you who don't need to stay around for the Q&A can hop off in time. One thing that your presentation reminded me of is on the export side, the Bureau of Industry and Security has a big workshop coming up in April that I thought this group might be interested in too. But I'll tell you, the slides are up. Thank you, Annie. Let me mention two things. We would really appreciate your feedback on this webinar. So you can either use that QR code, or I think there's going to be a link in the chat that also would take you to an evaluation. Be great if you could fill that out. And then we're really excited about International Women's Day, which is coming up fast. It's actually a week from tomorrow, next Friday, March 8th. And we're going to be having a panel of women that really embody the theme, which is Inspire Inclusion. And they're actually some folks within our own organization. We were looking all over the place for, I mean, there are lots of examples of women that are doing wonderful things, but we realized right within our own organization, there are women who are outside of their regular job doing things to inspire inclusion. So we're going to be featuring them for International Women's Day, and we hope you can join us. So those are the two items on the slides. And then I did want to see if I can just share my screen for a second here. Mentioning the thing that I said from the local district export council, which Stella is part of, are offering this workshop, 2-day workshop, complying with U.S. export controls. So it's going to be very similar to the types of things that our speakers today were speaking about on the import side, but this is on the export side. And I want to make sure the slide got up onto the recording so people can look at it later on. And then one more thing to mention is if you aren't already on our email list, you go to our main page, you will see on the top right, you will see the list, the event that I just mentioned, but you also can scroll down and add yourself to our email list and receive future invitations to events and things like that. And we got a couple minutes left, so I'm going to open it up to questions and answers. And we had one already, which I will just read for you from an anonymous attendee. What are best practices to manage dual country of origin sourced items? That sounds like a long question, long answer.
So
it can be, yeah.
It can be. I'll start us out, and Casey may jump in with some additional information. So there are two things that we could think of here when we think of dual sourced items. You could think of something that has multiple countries of origin because it's a set. You've got lots of different items inside of it, and they each have their own country of origin. In a case like that, you'll look at the good that provides the essential character of the set. So if we're thinking about like a hair clipping set, the essential origin of the set might be the like kind of hair clippers or the electronic clipper, the thing that you bought the set for, in other words, and the origin of that item will predominate over the whole set. In other cases, if we're thinking about fungible items that have all been commingled together, if you can visually inspect the goods and you know that some of them are stamped with origin, you might be expected to figure out using your inventory management system, either FIFO, LIFO, sorting them into lots based on that marked origin, and just keep track of it. But if they're truly commingled and you can't separate them out, and in some cases it might be like nuts or bolts or things that you couldn't even mark to start with, in those cases, if you can't visually distinguish them and they're intermingled, we would actually just list the country of origin of all of the possible countries that each of those individual goods came from when you imported them. Casey?
Yeah, so I've got one more to add to that, because there's also, I know there's dual sourced items where you're manufacturing an item in both China and Vietnam, for example, and how do you keep track of that? And that one's kind of a difficult process. A lot of it is based on how you can track it in your ERP. I've seen in some companies where it's actually tracked kind of on a spreadsheet and based on a PO level. And what I have seen in ERPs is taking your part number and then adding like a dash CN to it, or dash VN, so that when you're ordering from Vietnam, you would receive it against that SKU specifically. If you're ordering it from China, you would order it, and receive it against the one dash CN to keep track of it. I've also again seen it managed based off of PO, and so knowing the location, and then it's tied to a location. So the PO, is stored on this shelf, and we know that the PO was ordered from the Vietnam location, and therefore it's country of origin Vietnam.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. We're at 11:01, so we're going to wrap it up. But those of you who are on the webinar today, we thank you for your time. And if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to the two speakers, and feel free to reach out to us as well. At the World Trade Center, we can usually, if we don't know the answer directly, we know who will be able to answer your questions. So thank you very much. This ends the webinar, and I'm wishing everybody a great day.